If you wanna be solicitors, why don't you come and visit us at SQE TV?
This is SQE TV, the YouTube channel for wannabe solicitors with me, Jonny Hurst. In this video, we're going to be focusing on SQE pass rates and researching SQE providers.
SQE TV.
So this video is all about SQE pass rates. In particular, we'll be dealing with SQE1 pass rates in this video because we'll have a separate one dealing with SQE2 pass rates that we'll publish later on. And we know this subject is very, very important when it comes to the decision making of many students when they're choosing their SQE provider. So by way of background, well, what's the position? And I'm recording this video in the summer of 2023. Well, the SRA hasn't shared so far any data with SQE providers as to how their students are actually doing, which is very problematic for the providers, but also for you, the students. How are you supposed to be making a decision based on the track record of SQE providers when the SRA are not publishing any comparative data? And they won't publish any comparative data until the end of 2023 at the earliest. So what's happened is that course providers have taken it upon themselves to collect their own data. I'm sure they all have been doing so, but the interesting thing is that most course providers have not actually published any data as to how their students have done so far as at summer of 2023. So SQE pass rates, what do we know so far? Well, we know that the national pass rate for SQE1 in January 2023 was 51%. And that means 51% of all the students that sat SQE1 in January 2023 passed both of the SQE papers, FLK1 and FLK2 as they're called. And we say that, and certainly this is my view, that the SIT in January 2023 was the first statistically reliable SIT that you have to base any assessment of pass rates going forward. Why do I say this? Well, the demographics of the SIT and the numbers of the students who actually took part in the SQ1 assessment in January 2023 was much higher than previous SITs. For example, a year earlier there was about just over 1,000 students. Now there was 3 times as many. So you've got a much larger sample upon which to base an assessment as to what's typical for going forward. But what's more important is that the makeup of the cohort who sat in January 2023 was more typical of future cohorts. Why? Because there were more recent university graduates and there were proportionately fewer paralegals. And that is what the makeup and the balance of future cohorts is going to look like. So what we say is take pass rates prior to 2023 with a pinch of salt. I don't think they're very useful to rely upon, but do definitely focus on those that come from the January 2023 SIT and those that follow.
SQE TV.
Now, what I'm going to be showing over the course of the next few minutes are typical questions that are raised by students who are researching the pass rates for individual SQE providers. And what I want you to go away with is some tools so that you go into conversations with those providers if they're not providing you with all the information you require to the level of detail you need to make a decision to commit to them. And then ultimately, if they don't give you that information, you're left with a decision, well, can I trust them? Do I have confidence to go to them? And that's obviously a conclusion that you have to reach one way or the other based on all the other evidence as well and all the other factors. So we're going to have a look at 3 particular problems or conundrums that students have when they're researching SQE pass rates. And the first one is here from Ali. And Ali says, I'm looking at a provider who hasn't published any SQE pass rates. How will I know if their course is any good? Well, simple answer to that question is, well, you don't know. If the provider isn't sharing that information, how can you have the confidence, in one sense, to commit to them? Can you commit on reputation alone? I'm not sure you can, because the whole situation has changed. It's very different to the LPC. How are the new courses bedding down? If you don't know and if they won't share how their students are doing, you need to form your own conclusions in that regard. So when you get on the phone to these providers, you should ask them, well, are you tracking your students' performance? I'm sure you are, is what you should be saying, because why on earth wouldn't you? And if they say, well, we haven't really got enough information or enough data yet, you should ask yourself and put it to them, well, is it that you don't have the confidence to share the data, or maybe the data you've got doesn't actually give you the information that you want to put out to the market? Ask them that question and see what the response is. I don't know what it would be. I've never had those conversations. But these are the questions that you need to be asking where this information is vacuous. There is no information from a lot of providers, and I simply don't know why, other than the fact that maybe it's not too favourable. And that probably is the case when you think about it. If there's only 51% of students passing, how many providers want to go out with a pass rate of less than 51% or even 51%, just tracking the average? So this is something that I think we need to get to the bottom of as a student community and academic community, because it's not on for this information not to be shared.
SQETV.
The second concern I often hear from students who are researching the pass rates for SQE providers is the one that's posed here by Boomy. And Boomy says, I'm very concerned that the provider that I'm looking at is only quoting old pass rates for SQE1. Well, at least Boomy, you've got a number to go on compared to Ali in the first example who had nothing at all. But you're right, if the number that's been quoted relates to an exam sit that was some time ago, then you're right to ask further questions. One thing I would say is that, of course, exams are only sat twice a year for SQE1 in June and July, and it does take 2 or 3 months for the results to come out. So I'm recording this video in the summer of 2023, and therefore I am relying upon the most recent sit for the SQE1 exam as at January 2023. And as I said earlier, that is the most statistically reliable cohort for pass rates to be quoted for. And I would say disregard anything prior to that for the reasons I mentioned earlier. So Boomy, what do you do with this provider who is giving you this information that you feel might be a little bit out of date? Well, ask them the question, are you still tracking the performance of your students? And if they answer, yes, we are, then say, well, could I have the up-to-date information rather than the really old one that you've published? And if they turn around and go, well, we haven't quite collated the information or the data yet, blah, 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 don't say no for an answer. Say, I'm not stupid. You've had many months since the January 2023 sit. Why haven't you got the data? And the answer to that question will probably be a fudge or I don't know. And the real answer to that question, or at least the conclusion that I would say you can only reach, is that either they haven't got the data, or if they have got the data, it isn't favourable. Why else would you still be publishing data that is old if you have more up-to-date data? So from my point of view, what you need to be doing is really pressing any provider that isn't giving you really up-to-date information on their statistics, because ultimately, for you, it's important that when you make your decision, you're making it on the most up-to-date data rather than something that might well be out of date. Now, if they haven't collected data and they're saying, well, we haven't collected data since whenever, then you should always be asking this question, really, I'm not sure I believe that, because ultimately, surely you're checking how your students are doing. It would just be wrong for you not to. And if you haven't got the data, well, is it because maybe you're not asking for it because you're not confident that the number you're going to get is going to be any better than it was a year or two ago, or whenever the stat is that you're quoting from? Ask this question, have this conversation, put these individual providers who are quoting out-of-date pass rates under the microscope and ask the question, and then you can form your own conclusions.
SQETV.
The third question that I often hear from students who are researching the SQE1 pass rate claims from providers is like the one that's posed here by Chen that you can see on the screen. And Chen asks, can I rely on course providers' own pass rate claims? It's a really valid question, and it needs looking into in quite a bit of detail. And in fact, the devil really is in the detail in this question. Look and scrutinise each claim very carefully. Put individual providers' claims against each other. Look at them alongside each other, word for word. What's one provider saying that the other isn't? And if you see there are any gaps, then go back to that provider and ask to explain them. Obviously, we've already covered the situation in terms of how old the data is, how long ago were these exams sat that you're making this claim on. So I'm not going to repeat that, but again, that is a really important point. And anything prior to 2023 is something I would say you really should be disregarding. But also, how did the providers in question collate that data? How did they get it together? If they collected it across the whole cohort, that's obviously a good thing. But if they've taken it from a specific source, then you need to be asking yourself the question, well, is the statistic as reliable? So for example, if a provider's just taking the SQE1 results from people who've registered, say, on an SQE2 course, then that's probably going to give you a slightly skewed figure, because it won't include people that haven't registered on that course, who may have failed or may have deferred their SQE1 sit. So just be careful in terms of relying upon the numbers too much. Asking where they got their data from is quite an important question. Next, well, what proportion of students that overall registered on your course do you have that data from? And that's a really important question, because at some providers, I suspect there are quite high deferral rates, and therefore you do need to be asking yourself the question, well, are many of their students actually ending up sitting the assessment? So do look at that.
SQE TV.
So that was our look at SQE1 pass rates. Lots of things to take into account, but remember, SQE1 pass rates are not the only thing to take into account when choosing your SQE provider. So I hope you liked this video and you enjoyed it. You'll come along and watch more videos, including the look at SQE2 pass rates at a later date. It just remains for me to say, please do like this video, subscribe to the channel, and enjoy the jingle once more.
If you wanna be solicitors, why don't you come and visit us at SQE